Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for the inaugural Human Rights Summit here by San Francisco Pride. Again, I'm Michelle Miao, and I'll be moderating this discussion. We will be talking to activists from different parts of the country in regards to the anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation that is being proposed and, in some cases, passed. So let me introduce you very quickly to our speakers today. With us on the stage, across from me, we have Sue Robbins, who's with Equality Utah. Next to me, we have Dr. Alexis Petra, who's with TransClinique. And joining us via web conferencing, if you're sitting here in the Toby Auditorium room looking at the screen to your left, we have Nathan Broomer, who's with Equality Florida. And then to your right, we have Susan Williams, who's with the Transformation Project out of South Dakota. Let's give a warm welcome to our speakers. Let's begin by having each of you talk about what's happening in your world, in your state, in your community, especially with regards to the LGBTQIA+ or anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation that may be being proposed and or passed. We'll start with Sue.
Good morning. So in Utah, I'm sure a lot of people who haven't lived in Utah get a certain perspective of Utah based on what may be our predominant religion. And I can tell you that it is very different working in Utah than what most people might imagine. We are a very conservative state. The studies that I've seen over the last couple of years had us from the second to maybe the sixth most conservative state in the country. So it is very red. And in Salt Lake City, we have what we call our blue dot. But it is also impacted by that religion, and it has changed us over time. As many Californians will know, Proposition 8 was very big out here and supported by that predominant religion. And I think there was a bit of reckoning that came with it. And as we move forward since, we have seen the ability to get bills through that are good for us. In 2015, we had what was called the Utah Compromise, which was what's changed for us. And that's where we were able to get non-discrimination in both employment and housing. And the church worked with us to sign on to that. And as long as their religious liberties were protected, we were able to protect our community outside of church grounds, basically. And that started a chain for us. We were able to overturn a Don't Say Gay bill we had that we called No Promo Homo. And we did that in the courts. And once we started making ground in the courts, the legislature just voted a bill to turn it away. And we were the first red state to pass a hate crimes bill. We were the first red state to pass a conversion therapy ban. And we saw those impacts in this last session in particular on the sexual orientation side and not as much on the gender identity side. So where Utah's at right now is 72% of Utahns support marriage equality. And as long as we work with the legislature and we communicate and find what their concerns are, we find we're able to make headway on either preventing bills or having good bills on the sexual orientation related efforts. And if it happens to fold in gender identity like hate crimes and conversion therapy, then that's amazing and we appreciate that. But where we have a lot of future work is going to be around gender identity specific bills, where we've had a sports bill ban for our youth that was done in 2022, and it is currently enjoined, thank you NCLR, and it's still in the courts. And then this year we have a transgender youth healthcare ban that is lawsuits pending on that one that NCLR is working on with ACLU. So we have a lot of work to do on that side, but our history shows that if we can reach out and work together, that once they are educated on a community, that we can start making headway in our legislature in Utah.
Nathan.
Thank you. Yeah, Florida's history, well, up until the last couple of years, was pretty positive. Equality Florida as an organization came to be nearly 3 decades ago, and over the 25 plus or so years in our history, we're able to fight back every anti-LGBTQ bill that came forward, and saw a number of supportive bills and local human rights ordinances and other measures move through. In fact, the most co-sponsored bill ever proffered in our state legislature was the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, a state equivalent to the Equality Act. For a decade, we made great progress in hopes that that would pass. And that changed really 3 years ago. There was a single bill that passed under the notion that it was not an anti-LGBTQ bill, but it was focused on parental rights, which we know has now shifted in the narrative quite a bit. And last year we saw a handful of anti-LGBTQ bills and anti-trans bills proposed. Most got knocked down, but we had different outcomes in our elections. And this year, with a supermajority held by Republicans, we saw a record-breaking number of anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans bills come forward. So to listen to your ability to make some headway, as I heard the comments about Utah, I wish we were in a different place in Florida, and we're just frankly not right now. We're dealing with right now a number of new laws that have all come into place. They've all been signed. Some were enacted immediately upon signing. A good number will become law July 1st. And we've seen, though, some positive headway. I want to reference to some recent court decisions that I think give us a glimmer of hope. But as an attorney and as a lifetime advocate and as a trans Floridian navigating what this all means right now, for the most part, we're in a holding pattern around a number of things, even as we see the high points and the good news. I'll give you a quick highlight about what we saw that's already in place, and then bring you up to date on the decisions, including a decision that came in yesterday. And it does bode well. But I will say, unfortunately, we did see an expansion law for the Don't Say LGBTQ law that was put forward last year that expands all the harms from that very ambiguous and vague law, adding new harms about regarding pronouns and expanded book banning and a whole lot more. A lot of that is being seen through administrative rulemaking with the Florida Department of Education. A lot of the authority and procedural, ramifications, typically what local school districts used to be able to navigate now has been taken back to the state level. And more of that power has been now put forward through this expansion, unfortunately. I think the thing right now that our community is really battling with is the gender affirming care ban, which was a sweeping legislation that overruled parents' rights to make healthcare decisions for their children, created a felony penalty for physicians who were prescribing gender affirming care to minors, and it restricts our access as transgender adults in ways that I don't, we're still navigating what that means, but I will give you the two highlights. I will say the rulemaking has been another place where we've really been battling and seeing local community members show out in force. Hundreds and hundreds of folks. I was, little known fact, while we did have a lot of backwards momentum, we did have a statewide elected in Florida for a number of years. I was fortunate to work with her. Nikki Fried came in as our Commissioner of Agriculture. That's an elected position, but it's a very big statewide agency, just second in size and roles and responsibilities behind the office of the governor. Was fortunate and honored to be appointed as the first statewide appointed LGBTQ liaison who is trans in our state. And we saw a lot of great progress happen. But unfortunately now where we're at, even had little known fact, I had a state healthcare policy and did in fact receive quite affirming gender care for a couple of years. But that in the moment is not in place. The decision that came yesterday on the heels of the decision that came out of Wyoming that I think many folks are familiar with, basically took the rulemaking that was done around Medicaid that denied payment for both gender affirming care for youth and adults and turned it upside down. And they said it's discriminatory, it's non-constitutional, and we're done with it. That decision is really good news and comes on the heels of a second case right now that's a challenge against our Florida Surgeon General, Dr. Latipo. We also had a decision on June 6th. That was a preliminary injunction, which held that that law and the rulemaking are both unconstitutional. And I would say another glimmer of hope, not that many of you probably want to read an 80-page decision out of Wyoming or a 40-page decision out of Florida, but there are some good nuggets in there. One of which I think the most exciting I appreciate is a very large bolded title that will become, I think, an important part of the discussion as we move forward. The gender identity is real. And I realize for this audience that might not seem like something significant, but when the state has asserted that it's not, and the judge quite passionately, Judge Hinkle in this case, called out the elephant in the room in a very passionate way. I'm hopeful for the decision that's going to come in this case, and it may come in days or weeks, but we wait. In the meantime, and we'll talk about this a little bit, unfortunately, our access to care is all but on hold for many of us here in Florida, and we wait for further administrative rulemaking. I just got an update today before I jumped on this call. We're having a joint rulemaking committee tomorrow. And one of the ways the state of Florida is looking at using that administrative power is through the implementation of informed consent forms. And when they turn our care back on before beginning or continuing hormone replacement therapy, what the state is hoping to put forward, and we will fight like hell to prevent it, is a requirement that we undergo a thorough, quote, psychological and social emotional evaluation performed by a Florida licensed and board certified psychiatrist or psychologist before our prescribing physician can continue that treatment or start it. That's a huge burden and gatekeeping, and you may or may not know this, but very few attorneys and very few physicians are board certified. But we're in the moment right now, so the timing for this panel, these updates are happening as we go. The last most significant anti-trans law that we're also confronting is the bathroom bill. And it's a policy that creates a system, a harmful system, and one that I fear we've already seen results will increase confrontations and potential for violence against trans and non-binary people. There are no enforcement guidelines. It works against every notion around public safety and is creating environments for abuse and unfortunately harassment. The anti-drag law is also in place, as well as an additional license to discriminate in healthcare. And we're seeing that is really given broad license to refuse care under the auspices that it's around the procedure and not the person. But we're already seeing that, unfortunately, being used beyond really the intentions as discussed in session. And we also have had a number of attacks on higher education. All of those together, and I really am only highlighting about 6, all came through this year, and there are more, unfortunately. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
I have to take a moment. It's a lot. It's a lot. So I encourage if you have to take a moment, please do so. Susan.
Good morning from South Dakota. So nice to be with you all. Thank you, Michelle. Ours is a little bit short and sweet. So our anti-trans agenda started back in 2015. So we've been fighting these bills for over 8 years now. And we have done a pretty good job of defeating several of them, but we have 3 that I'm going to share with you today that I will highlight. So the first was several years ago. It basically made it okay to discriminate for people that were part of the queer community that wanted to adopt children. So basically, these adoption agencies could say, no, we don't give you the blessing of having a child. So that was the first. The second was brought by our governor last year. Our governor likes to definitely compete a little bit with Florida's governor. So she brought a bill to ban trans girls from playing sports. That went through. So that went into effect last year. And in about a week and a half, our gender affirming medical care ban for minors will go into effect. That law states that from July 1st to December 31st, physicians need to wean off transgender kids off of their puberty blockers and HRT, and effectively, stop their treatment. So trans kids would be off of their medications by January 1st, really erasing trans people from the landscape of South Dakota. So at this point, physicians have stopped seeing patients, will no longer see patients starting in July. No surgeries will be able to happen as well. And we know that very few surgeries happen in our state for minors. Many people think that there are all sorts of things going on in these states that are not going on. For some of our states, people need to travel to get a surgery. That would be helpful to help them to feel themselves. And so there's so much misinformation, as many of you know, and many of you have seen in your own states. So those are the things we're dealing with right now. We have already heard from legislators that next year they will be bringing a bill to ban minors from traveling across state lines to get medications like puberty blockers and HRT and surgeries. They're also focused on preventing people from changing their birth certificates, such as name and gender marker, and potentially bathroom ban, as well as many other things. So at this point, we are very grateful that we've been able to stop some things, but now it seems that the world is on fire. And, as you're hearing from all of us, there are things going on in other states that are making the news each day. So we take every grain of positivity, things that come out of the decision in Florida yesterday, Arkansas 2 days ago. There are some really wonderful things happening, but it is a challenging time to live in these days, for sure.
Dr. Petra, it's a good segue, from what Susan was describing, these types of bills. This really directly affects you as a doctor who provides telemedicine, telehealth to the transgender, gender expansive community.
Absolutely.
What's going on, and it sounds like there are states in which you cannot help.
Yeah, well, Michelle, as you can imagine, it's really been a roller coaster this year in terms of, disappointments and signs of hope. The first thing that happened wasn't even supposed to be an anti-trans legislation, but it was from the Drug Enforcement Agency, who said that, was trying to get control of telemedicine in general, and said that prescribing controlled substances such as testosterone wasn't something that they were comfortable with. So they were very close to shutting that down in May. And of course, that would have shut down anyone on HRT that was receiving testosterone nationwide via telemedicine. So that was quite a bit of people were scared. Fortunately, that cooler heads prevailed, and they gave us a 1.5-year stay for that. But that's wasn't even an anti-trans bill. So currently there's 557 bills, pieces of legislation out there in various states that are trying to ban gender affirming care in general. It's very difficult to keep up. As you can tell, this basically changes every day. I'm in 26 states, so there's very difficult to keep up with all the rules. But so far, I've been able to continue, especially the patients that I currently have. I'm still caring for them, and there's at least been stays in different states from Florida and places like that I'm still able to continue to provide care. And wink, wink. I can't wink very well, but there's ways to get it to them. So, so hopefully Ron
Underground.
DeSantis doesn't come up here and arrest me. I don't know, but
So we have a shipment
we'll see.
process and an underground process. We'll get to that. So we are hearing, the current landscape of the anti-trans, anti-LGBTQIA plus efforts of the legislators, elected leader, whatever. I hate even calling them elected leaders. They belong somewhere else. But how are we dealing with this? How are we responding? I'm hearing a lot of hope in your voices, but maybe not even hope, but we're not going down without a fight. Sue.
So for us, we're taking the approach of being educational, and that sounds painful, and it is. When we engage our legislators, and I'll give you an example, our conversion therapy ban previously was in policy, and this year it came up as a bill, but it came up as authorizing conversion therapy and allowing it to happen. So we reached out to our legislators instead of just jumping all over them in the news, and we said, let's sit down and talk. And we asked why they felt they needed to have this bill. And we started to have a very open and frank discussion with them, and we've come to find out that the bill came about because they didn't want it to be policy, they're legislators, so they want everything to be a law. But the wording was something someone just handed to them. So once we had that engagement and understood what their driving motives were, then we were able to start changing the bill. And we were able to make it a conversion therapy ban in a sense that they would accept it because they really weren't trying so hard to have something that allowed conversion therapy, but instead were trying to have something that was codified into law. And there was a little bit of side discussion that the policy left some open-endedness that therapists didn't like, and that was part of the discussion too. So we had our senior leadership, we had the bill sponsor, we had therapists in the room, and everybody talked, and then we came up with a bill, and it passed through unanimously to give us the conversion therapy ban. And these are the type of efforts that we feel like are going to be the ones that are going to get us where we need to be in Utah. Everybody has a different environment in the long run. As I said, it's going to be harder on gender identity because you just can't get in a room and get people to catch up years of being uninformed about our existence and our needs and the studies and everything that's happened in our history. But we are starting to change the divisiveness with our legislators by doing this, and we're starting to change the engagement, and we're starting to be able to turn things to where we can have discussions and either hold off bills. In this same year, we had a Don't Say Gay bill come out, and we sat down with the legislature that was sponsoring it and told them, this is just like Florida's. I'm sorry, it was, and it's horrible. So I feel the pain from having seen the bill. But once we said that, he goes, no, that's not what I'm trying to do. I just don't want them talking about sex in grades 0, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And we talked to them. He pulled out sexual orientation, gender identity, and then the bill really did nothing, and it died. We had the same with a drag ban that really didn't go anywhere because we sat down and there was the sponsor wanted to ban drag, but there was a lot of other people that weren't so sure of it. So when we had these discussions and started talking, the bill died at the end of session. And as a note, I know Amani said, I don't think there's been a successful challenge to a drag ban yet as a law. Just last Friday, we had a drag performance that had been kept from performing in a public space because they needed a permit, and the City Council of St. George turned them away, saying it was sexually explicit performance and they wouldn't allow it on their grounds. And that drag performing group won in federal court on First Amendment rights, that it's a public place and we have the First Amendment right to be able to be in that space and be ourselves. So we are seeing, as I said, a lot of advancements in Utah. We just don't have it in gender identity, and it's going to be a long educational process. I have a saying that I try and work with my community on, and that's education brings knowledge, knowledge brings understanding, and greater understanding brings social change. When we look at the arc of marriage equality, it took many years, and I'm afraid that with gender identity, we're in that same mode. It's going to take us years of educating our neighbors, our friends, and our family, and our legislatures. And over time, we will have the same acceptance. I said 72% of Utahns accept marriage equality. We'll get that same acceptance. Is we have to bring them along, and it's going to start by bringing in people who are in the more moderate area. We're certainly not going to change the minds of extremists, and unfortunately at times it feels like we spend a lot of time arguing with the extremist, and during that time we might be losing some of the people in the middle. And that's what we're trying to work on, is who are the people in the middle that are undecided. In an election they would be a swing voter. And how do we get messaging out there that we can start engaging them and not having them buy into the lies and misinformation that are out there about us? And that's going to take time.
Nathan.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think in Florida, we have seen a remarkably aggressive misinformation campaign. And I guess to borrow from a quote earlier I referenced from Judge Hinkle's injunction for our gender affirming care ban. I mean, we are dealing with both DeSantis and Trump, pushing forward with presidential campaigns and finding as many moments as they can to lean in on the rhetoric and on the misinformation. So aside from, I think, a lot of work in the movement, seeing trans folks included and in leadership positions, a part of strategic policy strategies. We've been playing, shorthanded and coming from behind for years, frankly. And, we've got to find ways to address that and do so aggressively. I'm proud of what our organization is doing at Equality Florida in partnership with many national organizations and local organizations. A lot of specifically Black, trans, queer, non-binary local organizations are forming everywhere. We're very much in an education mindset as well as an advocacy mindset moving forward. For us, there were more bills that passed, and we also saw an anti-trans sports ban go in place last year. That litigation is still pending, but we did win some. When we went into this legislative session and saw how long the list of bills to fight, we were really looking at 24 or so bills. There were compromises made. There were discussions. There were, hundreds and hundreds of citizen advocates that showed up and met with folks. Frankly, there were a lot of Republicans that wouldn't take meetings from constituents, so we didn't make nearly as much movement as we hoped, but at every committee hearing, we had folks on the record. And so we chose to educate and mobilize and push back every chance we could. We chose to, really force the questions in those committee hearings. And frankly, it set the record to really hear intentional discriminatory intent at every turn. We did ultimately have some wins. The original bathroom ban in Florida was for all public restrooms. That got removed. We also had a birth certificate. The procedure and the amendment procedure was included as a part of the gender affirming care ban. We got that withdrawn. I think we have concerns about where administrative procedures might go. but a lot of our community members get their news from social media, and I think there was so much going on nationally and even just within the boundaries of the state of Florida. Folks aren't aware of what passed and what didn't. And I gave you the highlight. These bills are huge. The plaintiffs in these litigation, what's being developed and what's currently being litigated, are attacking sometimes just one or two sections of some of these new laws because they're giant omnibus kind of bills. And it will take a moment. So we are holding town halls. Other organizations are holding town halls. And it will take, in those meetings, to go through the details and handle the questions that grandparents are asking because their 9-year-old trans grandson is scared to come into our state to go to Disney World with them. Like, we want to answer all those questions, and we've had town halls go 2 or 3 hours trying to address that. But it is building hope and minimizing the fear and anxiety. And frankly, we're also trying to deal with, what is a mental health crisis as much as a healthcare crisis, because folks are scared, and we're sharing resources. We're having to figure out where it's safe for us to go. There's an app called Refuge Restrooms that's been helpful that folks have shared. We have folks that don't have access to care because of lack of finances. So we're grateful for the partnership with Campaign for Southern Equality to provide a small grant to be able to access health care. And honestly, we're also celebrating Pride. So Equality Florida has been at every Pride mobilization. We heard there might be protesters, but honestly, to date, I'll tell you, at most of our prides across the state of Florida, we've been bigger and better, and performances have been going on, and we haven't seen what we had thought would be a much stronger show of resistance from the folks looking to cancel Pride. We've been celebrating. So those are some of the ways I think we're working in community, and we're educating voters. Because ultimately, we're not going to turn that around in the state of Florida unless we improve turnout and we elect folks who are equality minded and are going to start taking care of our community's needs. Thanks.
Susan.
So, just echoing so much of what the two previous speakers shared, there are some good things happening. One good thing happened in South Dakota last year. Our first, I know this sounds crazy, but our first out gay representative was elected into our legislature. So this, South Dakota is years behind so many states in the country, but we are dealing with a supermajority. We have 9 Democrats in our legislative body. So we are definitely, working with the moderates as much as we can. We had an interesting thing happen this past year. The moderates and the more, the people that are super anti-trans and bringing these bills every year, there was a lot of infighting, and there has been kind of a break in the Republican Party in our state legislature as far as who's extreme and who's not so extreme. And so we definitely, of course, know who to work with and who is a lost cause. I am one of those that came into this kind of work and thought, nobody's a lost cause. I'm going to meet with Representative Fred Deutsch, who, originally brought out the bathroom bill in 2016. And let's see how this goes. We're changing hearts and minds. And some people's hearts and minds are never going to be changed, no matter what happens, no matter what you do. But there are other people in the body who can hear a personal story and can hear about, like, someone like myself who has a transgender child in South Dakota and hear about our story, and their hearts may change a little bit, or their minds may change a little bit. But I think it takes, personal interactions with people, meeting with legislators. We try to arrange meetings with legislators with families in their district who have a transgender child or with transgender adults to meet with each and every individual. Our state is very small. We only have 800,000 people, so we have way more cows than people in South Dakota. So our legislators are very available to us and easily, reachable to have a meeting. And then we also, we take the wins, we celebrate them, and we get back to work. So right now we're focusing on, there are going to be some elections in a year and a half. So who is going to run? How can we educate those voters, like Nathan had shared? How can we let them know that trans kids are just trying to, live and breathe in South Dakota like everybody else? So I'm just trying to really focus on education, working with elections, getting great people to run, and having people turn up to vote.
Amazing. And Dr. Petra, I mean, you kind of alluded to it in your previous answer. How are you dealing with all of this? And you don't have to share exactly how you're getting gender affirming care to anyone who needs it, but yeah, how are you handling it?
Well, like I said, it's been in touch and go. I think education is really important. So your show is amazing year round, and radio show, the tireless, my panelists are here, tirelessly working, advocating, all that type of thing is what we need to do. Protect trans kids is a slogan, right? I mean, that's all what it's all about right now. One of my coworkers, Sam at Trans Clinique, we put out a podcast recently. So every week we have a new podcast which highlights a different trans person, just to educate and just learn about their daily lives and make, a lot of this hate and misinformation is because a lot of people have never met a trans person and they think they're the boogeyman, and it's easy to make someone you've never met, someone that's different, seem dangerous or whatnot. So we're just trying to normalize, trans people and say we exist, and we're here to live our lives, and we're not here to do anything bad. In terms of how am I helping out and still prescribing, all these laws, they're all threats mostly so far, and has been injunctions. Science and the AMA on June 12th. The American Medical Association came out in support of the American Endocrine Society, who basically said that gender-affirming care is life-saving care. So, I mean, this is science. This is, this is about life-saving care and protecting trans kids. So, I mean, that's a lot of the courts are going to see that and overturn some of these laws, I think.
Absolutely. I'm in a few here, open it up to you if you have a question for our speakers. So I'll be roaming around with the mic, and so if you could keep your question short and address one of the speakers, that would be great. So think about those questions, and they'll be right down. So how do we, people in California, people in San Francisco, we're here in San Francisco right now, how do we engage? How do we activate? How do we help? How do we make an impact other than to advocate? Is there anything specific I'm hearing, and especially around the politics or the political side? Sue.
What I like about going first is you don't have to worry about what other people already said and come up with something new. So the way I look at things is how we change the general public. We need to get over the 50% mark on things. So when you're in a potentially blue state, and I'll generalize it a little for anybody who might be traveling or hear this that lives elsewhere, you still have people who vote for Kevin McCarthy, let's say. So it's not like California is this great big blue swath. And when we look at things that are passing right now in the state legislatures, we need to remember that we still have a federal government that might do an Equality Act someday or some version of it. And if we can start changing the hearts and minds of people within our states, instead of potentially we pass the law, so live with it, which is what's happening to us the opposite way in a red state, then that starts to move the needle for us, because we need society in general to move our way. So even though you may have good laws, there's still people out there that we want to bring along for the ride, that we want to call them in and instead of calling them out. So that way they know that we are the kind and caring people. And as said is, we just need to have people humanize us and then know they know someone who's transgender. So from a blue state perspective, to me, you have family and friends in other states also. So it's not just within your own state. Our world has changed. I don't have any family that lives in the same state. And that's true for many of us, where you have family and friends spread out. So what you live, what you breathe, what you say on social media is seen by all these people who know and love you. And if you're able to bring them in along for the ride instead of pushing them away, that makes a difference. And we do that through kind and loving education and caring. And we've got to dial down the rhetoric that the other side's trying to pull us into. As I say, sometimes it's, we use a lot of our emotional energy going after the people who are on the farthest extreme because they say such bad things. But when we have that happen, one is we see the people in the middle are seeing what we do, and they're like, well, I'm not sure that that's something that's convincing me. But also, it then burns out that emotional energy that we have that we could be using on people more in the middle that we can bring with us. So I think we need to be thoughtful, and I don't want this to sound like tone policing to anybody. Everybody gets to say and do what they wish. But I do feel like if we can direct our efforts more towards those in the middle and do it in a more kind and caring tone that I know we all have because we're such a wonderful community, that we can start turning the tide and bring those numbers up of people who know us and people who support us.
Nathan, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. Having done, political work for a number of years, I think what you just spoke to, we have traditionally said to focus our efforts on the movable middle. And we talked years ago, and we did research into the messaging that works, right? The idea that if we don't know someone who was LGBT, or we don't know someone who's trans, it's a little hard to get into the fight, right? And, the experts have told us how to talk about this. And we got away from, I think, some of that. We have more personal relationships. The Williams Institute has come out with great research updated, year over year about how many folks actually know what our lives are like. What are our experiences, and to see us being visible. Florida's got the fourth largest LGBTQ population in the country and the second largest trans population. At least we did until this year. I don't know when the numbers come out, when we're talking about what you all could do. The reality is that a whole lot of folks I care about are choosing to leave. Families with young trans kiddos are leaving. I have a lot of friends who retired to Florida who are trans folks, and they're amazing. And, they went back north where there was, just more positivity. And I get that. And I don't, everyone has to make a personal decision for what they will do. But many of us are staying in states like Florida and doing what we can. And so I would say what I know for folks who are moving to certain areas, getting healthcare is still hard. The wait lists are getting longer because folks from multiple states are moving to the some of the major metropolitan areas that have had gender affirming care. And so there are resources that will be needed when folks come. They may come to you all. But frankly, before we get to the political ramifications, I honestly would be remiss to not say, send your resources to Florida. We are finding creative partnerships to get healthcare to work here. We're seeing folks like Plume decide to put doctors on the ground because the way our law reads, we need that initial appointment with an MD or a DO in the room to provide informed consent. And then, at least for now, until we know how telehealth goes, we have to stay up to date on that, right? We can continue to provide care. But we're seeing, some surgeons choose to leave the state. but we need resources. What I mentioned earlier, the Campaign for Southern Equality is putting together a fund to help support people. And that resource may be providers or it may be financial. But we've got to hold our elected officials accountable. I mean, there were a lot of Republicans, you've probably seen the reports come out of Florida. They didn't want to be lockstep with DeSantis on what his agenda was, but they didn't vote against it. And the conversations we have across all communities, we used to meet folks where they were, even if they weren't going to vote with us on our issues. We have to keep doing that, as hard as that is. And if they're not going to stand up and lead with courage, then we vote them out. And we have to get behind the candidates that will continue to do the work. So mobilizing those resources, it takes a lot of people, it takes a lot of volunteer hours, and it takes a lot of money to do that. But collectively as a nation, we have to recognize the moment we're in. I think some states are being impacted more greatly than others, and where we can partner and support one another, I hope we do that. I could list so many great organizations that we've partnered with. We're continuing to explore new partnerships, and we have to, I think, continue to do that. And we can't spend all of our time and energy combating all the misinformation out there. It has to be strategic, because sometimes those that are loudest and get the message out there first tend to win that argument. So I still think some of those folks are technically in the middle, even though I've watched them shift. I had a really tough conversation with a gentleman when I was working for the state of Florida in Tallahassee after a day of legislating. And he didn't know who I was. And he sat next to me watching sports at the end of the day and basically said that, he didn't agree with this marriage equality. He kept apologizing. He's like, I don't know your beliefs, but I'm a Christian man. I'm a godly man. That after my father died and I realized what that moment was like, I can't imagine anybody dying without somebody there with them. And I can't agree with, the marriage equality, but I sure wouldn't want anybody who's LGBTQ to die alone. Now, that doesn't sound like a big win, but it was a moment where we at least could come together and agree at some moments in our lives that we have to, work on that together. Who knows if the game was longer, where else the conversation would have gone. But he and I were absolutely not politically aligned in any way. And that was one small place where we could at least agree. And I hope we find more moments like that with folks on both sides of the aisle. Thanks.
Agree. Susan, anything to add before we go to questions from the audience?
Very quickly, yes. One other thing I would love to add is for cis people to start standing up and really taking some of the burden off the backs of our trans friends and family members. There are so many trans people that are having to, fight this fight and deal with all the things that come along with being a marginalized person who is being attacked across our country right now. So if we can even, take a little bit of the burden off by, learning about our own bias, learning about how to be a good ally, and really influencing others in our circles to be an ally to the trans community and the broader queer community as well, I think we're going to see some mountains be moved. And maybe you're in California, maybe you're already doing those things, but there's always more you could do. So stand up, let people know that you are there for all of it, whatever that means to you. And stand up and make a difference in your own community, and it will send ripple effects throughout the nation.
Hi, Susan. My name is Tucker. I actually grew up in South Dakota. I escaped when I was 18, and I try to go back often. First, thank you all the panelists for being up there. My question is directly to you. I donate to the ACLU. I donate to South Dakota Public Broadcasting. I will now be donating to your organization. Who else can I help in South Dakota?
Tucker, it's so nice to meet you. What city are you from?
I grew up just outside of Rapid City.
I love it. Okay. So, thank you so much and congratulations on your escape. Next time you're home, look me up. I'd love to get together. Our organization's is Transformation Project South Dakota. We have a fund started for kids that are needing to travel for gender affirming care, called the South Dakota Trans Resilience Fund. But I would also say other organizations in South Dakota would be Equality South Dakota is doing some amazing work. My other organization is a C4. We are the ones that fight for the dignity and justice of all trans people with legislation. So Transformation Project Advocacy Network. But yeah, there are a few in South Dakota, not as many as some of the other states represented here, but we're growing, and I think you'll see more organizations come out of all of these attacks. So thank you.
Hi there. So we are parents, and we are strong allies in terms of making warm and welcoming spaces in churches, Pride Prom events, all of that kind of stuff. But at this point, we see we need to do more in terms of advocacy with laws, and I really just don't know how to get started. I've been with the ACLU to Sacramento for one bill, but basically I'm ready to do something more in terms of advocacy, and I don't really know how to start.
Any one of you can take that on. Sue, looks like you're ready.
So over the last year, what I have been presenting to Utah families and anyone who's listening to me out there is engagement is a year-long process in legislative work. Our legislative session is only 6 weeks long, probably the shortest in the nation. It just comes hard and fast, and it's very difficult days. So once we're in that moment, our legislators who have their cell phone numbers and their email addresses posted online, we're very much able to reach to them. But if you think of them going from about 9, 10 a.m. to near midnight every single day between committee hearings and floor time, their ability to respond is reduced. So I recommend to our communities, get to know your legislator, contact them regularly, and reinforce the thoughts that you have and build a relationship. That way, when things are more in the heat of the moment, your message doesn't look like one of other hundreds. And it's going to vary on the states, because some states, they may have interns doing the email. So if you're able to meet and talk with your legislator and express your opinion, they need to know what people who are voting for them think. So for those states that are more like Utah, where you don't have a lot of people between you and your legislature, that's my recommendation. Further, what you say in your family circles and in your social circles rubs off on other people. So I appreciate you being an ally, and thank you very much. If you don't do this, think about what you're allowing in your spaces if someone says something that's wrong. I know often we want to be able to have a good time and have family time, and we hear something and we just kind of blow it off as Uncle Bob and let it go. The time to let it go has passed. We all need to be speaking up and saying, kindly, it's family, it's our friends, but that's wrong. Why are you repeating that? Let me tell you about the transgender youth I know and why that's wrong.
Well, we're winding down on time, and so let's spend a second here thanking our speakers, Nathan Broomer, Equality California. I'm stuck in California. Equality Florida, Sue Robbins with Equality Utah, and Susan Williams, a Transformation Project out of South Dakota, Dr. Alexis Petra with Trans Clinique. Let's give a big, big, big applause for our speakers. We thank you so much for all that you do, continue to do. I know it's not easy. We'll leave our our audience here, I know that Susan, you had already mentioned some organizations to support, but just a few seconds, each of you mention any other organizations you'd like for folks to support. So, Nathan?
Yes, Equality Florida would appreciate the support, of course, and I would also encourage folks to support the Campaign for Southern Equality, specifically denoting their Trans Emergency Fund. That is being utilized quite a bit, and as quick as it's coming in, it's going out, and that's something that's offered for a number of states, including Florida. Thank you.
Sue?
So most people tend to donate to their own states, and I support that. But if you're in a state where things aren't as harsh as you're hearing up here, I strongly support the efforts of the National Center of Lesbian Rights, Lambda Legal, and the ACLU, who are out there winning lawsuits and injunctions for us. We need more lawyers. I think this push has really capped out the amount of lawyers they have. So if they're able to get more funding, then we can challenge more of this.
Dr. Petra?
Well, in addition to Trans Clinique, of course, because we really are doing a lot in terms of providing care in a lot of these states that are that people are, have quite a bit of under access to care. Nathan, we're still very active in Florida, transclinique.com. So happy to take care of anyone in Florida. In addition to that, obviously the trans community is really under attack right now, and they will be for the next year and a half until the next election, I'm afraid. And Trans Lifeline is pretty amazing in terms of what they do to help people that are really feeling lost and scared. So I think that's another organization that I would definitely donate to a lot, and I would support.
Well, thanks again to all of our speakers, and thank you to you for joining us for this panel.